Welcome everyone to the February ACLS webinar on communication, contracts, and insurance. It's a roundtable discussion and it will be hosted by Brian Foust, who is an architect. And we have 3 artists, 2 liturgical consultants, and 1 architect. Go ahead, Brian.
Well, hello, everyone. As she said, my name is Brian, and just to introduce the topic today a little bit more, we're going to be talking about, as she said, communication, contracts, and insurance. So there will be no beautiful images shared today. We won't be talking about the deep theological implications of our work. We'll be focusing more on some of the mundane things. Mundane, but important. As we said, communication is important. It's key to what we do. And contracts really are kind of one of the ways which you can lay the groundwork for good communication by understanding with the owner the scope that you're going to put forward, what you're going to be doing. And then the insurance is there to protect us in case something were to break down and go wrong. But as most of us are, as she said, architects, artists, or designers, you know, we sometimes tend to not have that business brain. We tend to think about more the artistic and the deep side of stuff. But this is very important that we understand what we're doing and how we can lay this stuff out and use this to our advantage to work with us. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We have a round panel discussion. I'll add a slight disclaimer here at the beginning as well. You know, people are speaking from their own experience regarding, in particular, the contract side and the insurance side. We would encourage anybody to reach out to a lawyer and an insurance salesman to understand the implications of what that means for them, to get that professional advice. And also it might vary depending upon the project that you're working on or the jurisdiction that you're in, what types of contract you need to build out and the insurance that you might need. So please reach out to any professionals for good advice on that. But we'll be speaking from our own experiences here to let you know our own insight into how that might work. But I do want to introduce everybody who's going to be speaking on the roundtable today. So I'll just I'll call your name, and if you could just tell us very briefly a little bit about yourself and what part of the what perspective you'll be speaking from on the panel today. So reach out to George if you could introduce yourself.
Oh, very good. Yes, George Holzemann. I am a liturgical consultant and artist.
Paul?
I'm Paul May. I'm an architect in Minneapolis. I have about a 50-person firm and spend a lot of time in faith-based work.
Claire?
I'm Claire Wang, a liturgical glass artist in Dallas, Texas.
And Karen?
I'm Karen Schmidt, and I'm a sculptor and a liturgical artist, now retired.
Well, I just want to thank you guys all for being willing to speak and share your thoughts. Also, a quick shout out to Ken for helping us think through this roundtable and help us think how to organize it as well. But let's jump into our questions here. So first question here is that there are many different parties who are working on church projects, and everybody has kind of different roles and responsibilities. Could you briefly describe what your role is on a typical church building or renovation project? George, I'll reach out to you first.
Okay. The liturgical consultant can assist in everything from catechesis and formation to organizing committees, selecting architects, selecting artists, all the way to working with the diocese and working through norms and regulations and basically keeping the project on track.
Great. Paul, could you talk about the roles and responsibilities of an architect?
Sure. Many similar things we'll find as what George mentioned. A lot of communication with the committees, with the pastor, with the priests. We tend to be involved right at the beginning, sometimes before the liturgical consultant, sometimes after. But one of the things that we guide the project all the way through construction, which means we need to be licensed professional in our jurisdiction, wherever the location is, which also, as we'll talk about a little bit later, we sign all the drawings and have a tremendous amount of liability for the project as it moves forward.
Great. And Karen, could you talk a little bit about the roles and responsibilities from the artist perspective on a project?
Yes, I think the artist's perspective is to gain the information and knowledge of the church and the commissioning body, and work towards their vision. And the design consultant helps that a lot. But we create works of art, whether it's stained glass or sculpture or artisans creating furniture, all of those things to fit into the space.
Great. Claire, would you have anything to add from the artist perspective?
I think Karen did a great job. Yeah, I agree with what she says.
Great. Church projects tend to be very long, and there are a lot of people involved in the project, and kind of people kind of come and go as phases go on. George, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the timing of a liturgical consultant's work on the project. When are they typically kind of brought on to a project?
Well, there's when they ideally should be brought on, which is at the very beginning, so that the whole process can flow smoothly, and when they're typically brought on, which is when things are starting to get confusing, especially from a liturgical standpoint. But I always recommend that you try to get your consultant on board as early as possible, because they can really make a difference in making a smooth project and getting things organized right at the very beginning.
Great. And Paul, from the architect side, when are you typically brought in on a project?
Well, many times it varies. Oftentimes we'll start at a feasibility study with a parish. What do they need? What they looking for sites for a new parish, or doing master planning to try to organize how much land do they need, whether they should renovate or not renovate, and just trying to set some scope with regard to size, location, and sequencing of how things work.
And then Claire, as an artist, what time in the process do you typically get brought on?
I have found that it's pretty specific to being an artist working in glass. I don't know if it's the same for other disciplines, but because the glass is going to interface so much with the architecture, be that leaded glass or carved glass relief sculpture, there's always considerations as to the size, the size, the orientation of the windows, which can actually be changed before final design drawings are done. And also what the walls need to support glass sculpture that's going to be cantilevered from a wall, things like that. So I find that I've usually been brought on after liturgical consultants, but as early as possible, because there's a lot of considerations that I can talk about later.
Nice. And Karen, as a sculptor, do you get brought on later than, say, an artist for doing stained glass would be?
It's happened that way in my experience. Some churches have brought me on, and consultants brought me on sooner, but it's wonderful to get to see the process. And I mean, lighting is important. There are things like that really need to come in early, and they need to know the scope of the project financially.
And George, there's some other artists that get brought in as well, and craftsmen, kind of furnishings, fabric art, metalware, the altar, glassware, holy oils. When do you see these types of other consultants for artistic work being kind of brought in?
Generally speaking, once you've got a basic concept, it's good to start bringing in your artists, because the more they're involved in the process, the better relationship they can develop with the committees and the community, and the more effectively they can design and have creative sessions, etc., so that it's the community is more engaged in the process of creating the work. Obviously, you don't want to wait until things are in the dry, because that's when things are getting a little tight, deadline wise. But I usually like to see artists brought in practically as soon as you've got an organized plan for the church.
And Paul, I'll ask you a follow-up question as well. What other parties or individuals are a part of these projects? Is there anybody that we haven't mentioned yet that might be a key role in the process of a church project?
As everybody on this call, when you say the word committee, we get all sorts of characteristics that can be, but there's typically a building committee that helps guide it along. Oftentimes, there might be the parish may choose to hire an owner's representative to help guide the project all the way through, depending upon the size and talents of their building committee. We will see fundraising consultants as projects go through. There's not only the building committee that we like to think of as guides it along, but there may be multiple other parish committees that may be part of listening sessions, that may be part of things as it relates to acquisition of pieces, or specific related to any of the artistic elements throughout the process. So goal is to have a working committee that works really well and can also get work done.
So that sounds like a lot of people kind of being put into a pot to make a lot of decisions in crucial timelines, dealing with cost, and I'm sure there are personality fights going on as well in there. So good and clear communication is important to any project, the success of a project. And so what are some best practices to facilitate and maintain good communication? We'll stick with you, Paul, here. What do you recommend for your clients to facilitate good communication?
Well, I always like to start with prayer. It's a nice way to start every meeting, and oftentimes closing with prayer, and we're really lifting it up to the Lord for all the things that we do, because we're stewards. We're stewards of everything. But it's also important, many of us talk about deadlines and schedules, to really open up with, at the beginning of the project, set timelines, set key milestones, so that we can manage expectations at some of these milestones. What decisions need to be made here? There might be decisions that need to be made later, so that we can say it's a good idea, but we don't have to come to a conclusion right tonight. It can be at such a point, because it really helps manage the expectations of the committee, of the design professionals. When are deliverables on that timeline, so that we know what would be discussed at any of the meetings, and really what is critical and when, so that we can, as a team, collaborate, knowing how we get from beginning to end.
Karen, as an artist, how do you recommend communicating with your clients in a clear and good way?
Right. Well, hopefully when I'm brought on, I can meet the committee, we can build a relationship, and I can glean, if they feel heard, and that I understand the vision, their charism, where's their heartbeat as a church or a hospital, and be able to put that into the art. So I think frequent communication, anything that you would do in a good, healthy relationship with any professional relationship, humility, those kinds of things. But I think especially frequent communication when there is a problem, like a delay in the foundry, and the deadline is going to have to be pushed back, things beyond my control. So having that honest, open relationship, I send videos, photographs, at each stage of the process, and communicate that I value them and their input. Claire probably has more to say on that.
Do you have anything to add, Claire, from the artist perspective?
Well, I kind of look at this from a slightly different angle. I learned about midway through my career that the best approach for me was to have a sheet that I wrote out, because typically these folks have never commissioned a work of art before, and a sheet that was called About Process. And it's a sheet front and back, which defines in detail the process I used to go from that initial meeting to the installed work. And it gave a whole lot of, a sense of comfort to the client. Many of them would always comment, "Thank you for that. We didn't know where we were going." So that was helpful. Another thing that I found helpful was a sheet that I called Reaching a Cost Estimate, so that they could understand that part of that would be to bring me to the site, and that would be at their expense, so that wasn't a question. And then what would go on during that initial consultation meeting. And as Karen said, to get their ideas, to try to get the feeling of who they were. And from that meeting, I would develop what I called a client comment list. That's what guided the design all the way through. And then the third thing that I would do would be to present a cost proposal that had the same language in it as the final contract. Same kind of heading, same wording, what came under what heading, so that there was no ambiguity between those two legal items, I guess you could say. And then the fourth thing I'd say is just always hit reply all on your emails, not just reply. We had been around with that, having to redo things and resend information because one person just hit reply and not everybody got the information. So those are the practical things I would do.
Yeah, it's interesting. I sometimes use the phrase client education when you're working, because you just don't know what people know and what they don't know. And so, sometimes over explaining things or just presenting that little bit extra piece of information can sometimes just help people click and understand what is actually happening as you're going through the process. But George, as a liturgical consultant, do you talk about the importance of good communication at the beginning of a project when the building committee is being formed?
Sure. This is a point where a lot of listening is really important, so that you understand what the concerns are, what the anxieties are. You can also sometimes detect where there could be bumps in the road just by listening to people and hearing, like I said, concerns and anxieties. The consultant needs to be, as one person described to me, a non-anxious, neutral presence that can listen to anybody and everybody, will help people feel heard, at the same time manage oftentimes contradictory desires, goals, ideas in such a way that peace is maintained, unity is maintained in the whole thing. Sometimes a consultant is going to have to step in and say, look, we're not listening to each other, we're not communicating effectively, and try to straighten things out. And there's a myriad ways of doing that in a positive manner. And sometimes it just depends on the personalities involved. It's kind of like teaching. Discipline is not the same. There's no one size fits all approach. You just got to know how to handle the different personalities, sometimes on the fly.
Yeah, I can imagine that can be one of the harder aspects of the project is recognizing when bad communication is there, and then being able to kind of navigate all the relationships and the dynamics to steer it towards a healthy outcome.
Absolutely.
Well, let's shift a little bit and let's talk about proposals and contracts and kind of what are best practices for developing them. that we can have clear communication of scope and work of what we're doing. You know, if we don't know what we're doing, we can't do it well. So I guess first off, on a typical project, who's the responsible party that you're contracting with? Who's actually signing the contract that you work with? Paul, who typically signs that in your case?
Well, usually it's the priest. He signs it oftentimes with this parish administrator looking over it, or sometimes they both co-sign it, and that just, I think within that, the agreement time and time again to walk through every step that's in it, and take whatever time it is to explain anything that's in there so that everyone feels comfortable. It is something that we do all the time, and this might be the only project that this committee and this group will ever work on. And you want them to feel comfortable with deadlines, fees, scope, schedule, what happens when things turn a little left or right, or and how they get resolved.
And George, do you typically sign contracts with the same people, or do you contract with other people?
It depends. The priest winds up being the person signing very frequently, but also I've had occasions where it was the business manager or the parish manager. And in some cases, depending on the scope of the project and the nature of the project, it's the bishop or the diocese that signs the contract. It just varies depending on local requirements. I had one situation where the bishop required all contracts, no matter how small, to go through his office. And other times the priest can do it. Other times the priest delegates to other people on the pastoral staff. So it can vary.
And Claire, who are you typically signing a contract with in your projects?
Always with the church body, St. Francis of Assisi, with the address, with the priest's name underneath, as sort of, because that priest could be moved on, he could, whatever. So the church was the owner, and then the priest was the representative who signed it.
And getting into a little bit of the nitty-gritty of contracts, Paul, what does a typical contract for architectural services look like? How do you structure your fees? Kind of what's in there in the details?
There's a couple of ways we do it. Sometimes if it's early, like a feasibility study or a master plan, we can do a simple letter of agreement that lists scope, our understanding, the schedule, and the fee, because we don't know yet what the project will be. And if it becomes, ultimately that may lead into a project that is defined, it's so many square feet, it's on this location, it's going to involve that. And then there's the American Institute of Architects have a myriad of agreements that have gone through many legal challenges and has a lot of language. It can be 35 pages long, and that was something, like I had mentioned before, we walked through all the steps in there. It says what the scope of work will be, when deadlines are, when deliverables are. It outlines the key milestones, and as it relates, then there's a compensation in there. Who are all the consultants that might be part of this agreement? It might be a liturgical consultant. They might be hired independently. It might be all of my engineers that work for me. It might be a capital campaign consultant. And the fees can be a percentage of construction. Sometimes that works. Sometimes it's just a flat fee. Sometimes it's a combination of both, and we work our way through it. The hardest thing is we know on any project is if there is scope creep, like as long as you're here, why don't we look at this? there's language in the agreements that say when that occurs, what happens? Do we bring it to their attention? We say, do you want this additional work to be done? And we can adjust our compensation or the compensation of the consultant members accordingly.
Thank you. And George, from a liturgical consultant side, how do you establish your fees? Is there a typical scope of work that you do for most projects, or does it vary project to project?
It varies, and consultants don't have the extensive contractual and agreement requirements that the AIA has, that Paul was talking about. But typically I ask for a retainer. It's pretty moderate just to get things started so that we can work on a comprehensive scope of work. And then you can do things hourly, but on a bigger project, usually a flat fee or a monthly agreement. Small projects could be something as simple as a fee for doing presentations. And that winds up being worked out with the parish in discussion about what their budget is and the extent that they want the project. I mean, the extent to which they want the consultant involved. So.
Well, Claire, from the artist perspective, and I know you're Claire, I know you're doing the stained glass work, and so it could probably vary greatly depending upon what sort of artistic discipline you're working in. But what are the essentials to your type of contract? How do you structure that? Are there any pitfalls that you put in there to protect you from things, or notify an owner of things that might be happening during the course of a project?
Yeah, kind of the approach of my contract is to take care of the situations where there may not have been great communication or maybe not great communicators on the committee. So my contract kind of goes step by step through trying to avoid those pitfalls in a written document. One thing, Paul, you said something. You said you alluded to additional work. That's definitely something I have in my contract, that, you know, oh, well, maybe you could design some banners for us, or do you think, you know, when there's different ideas so I clearly define exactly what the project is, and then I have a heading, additional work, with a fee for that, how those fees happen. I also have in my agreement every item that's included, and then every item that is not included. That gets all the way down to how many trips I'm going to make, how many meetings we're going to have. Just very specific, a lot of specifics. Another is to describe the project in as much detail as I can, even though it, you know, is a design that's not done yet, the design intention. And this is all based, as I said earlier, on those client comments from that first meeting. So that's kind of a guidepost so that we don't get midway through a design phase and have different ideas on the design direction. Then let's see, the total project cost, additional services, reimbursable expenses, what's considered reimbursable, and defining those costs, are, you know, as much as can be done. And then I go through describing my services, which include the initial design phase, the intermediate design phase, and the field measuring phase, and the final design phase, with notations throughout those as to what these mean and what they bring up. But it's an opportunity to specify what you're doing and then what's not included in that phase. And then the fabrication phase and the installation phase. Then there's a heading specifically for those possible additional services and what those might look like. Then I have a section what the owner's responsibilities are. And it's kind of obvious what theirs are, except I would say for at what point does the owner take possession of the project? In my case, that's important because when 3 crates of glass arrive to the project site, who takes over responsibility for what do you call insurance for those panels should any get broken during the installation? Well, it clearly states that they are responsible for taking on, as soon as they accept those crates, the project belongs to them and the insurance shifts to them. And that they, other details that aren't important to say now. And another big one, alteration of the project site. I had a project once where, the size of the windows was changed, and I didn't know about this till way later on. And that initiated a whole lot of redoing of the designs to stretch them wider than they would have been, which might seem to be simple, but just to have any kind of change to that project site to make me aware of that, so that any changes that ensue are at a compensation. And then the last thing I would mention, I do have a payment schedule, but that's speaks for itself. But I had a section called terms and conditions of the agreement, and it was 7 bullet points covering things like if my suppliers reneged on me, or if I received glass that was broken and the whole shipment arrived broken from the supply, things like that, things that whereas I could be liable, that I wouldn't be liable in the long run, and that we agreed to that ahead of time, because glass is such a breakable substance. And the other item in there that was important for a glass artist is that I would be held, I would be indemnified from any, claims of damage due to the glass breaking or anything. If anybody was hurt, that they couldn't hold me accountable for that. That's important if you're doing glass. And I think an ownership of documents that I own the designs, and any desire to make those into, print up the designs and make Christmas cards or things like that, that had to be by agreement with me, but the pretty commonplace things.
Well, Karen, do you have anything to add from the sculptor's element? Is any of that change a little bit, or any nuances from your perspective?
Mine is not as complicated as Claire's, because sculpture has fewer stages. And I would say it's in the contract that I don't begin work until I've received the first payment, because people will want your design. And so the intellectual property is an important aspect for artists, because there have been cases, I know one in particular, where the artists were competing for receiving a position or a commission, and the church took the artist's design and had someone else do it, and didn't pay the artist for anything. So there really, protection is so, I mean, all the purpose of all these things is to protect the client as well as the artist. So right, that is, and I think that covers all of it. The copyright thing was important, and that the designs, that's good. Mine's a little shorter, but it works.
Well, speaking of protection, I'd like to move on to insurance. It's the one thing that we don't realize we need it until we actually need it, and have to use it at some point. But each discipline here that's talking, you all have different levels of risk and liability in a project. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about some of those differences, and how does your discipline manage that risk and liability and through the process of insurance. And so Paul, from the architect's perspective, what are kind of industry standards that you work around in utilizing insurance?
Well, because a lot of it's health, safety, and welfare. That's what our structures, that's what our license agrees to do that. So things related to codes and both the site and the building itself. We carry what we call errors and omissions insurance, which is something that it's required that we have if we forget something, if we design in a manner that the stairway doesn't meet code, or the things like that. And we carry, based on size of the project, that might be $3 to $10 million worth of insurance that we carry for our office, and then it applies to each project. There's also personal liability and insurance, and injuries related, if you're out on the job site, even driving to a client meeting during schematic design, it tends to be in there as well. There's also, it extends beyond the life of the project for something that might happen if the wall moves or the foundation moves. We have statute of limitations. Every jurisdiction's a little different, but it usually is anywhere from 7 to 12 years that statute of limitations goes. So it's good to close a project on happy terms as it is to start a project on happy terms, because we'll be talking with them. There's also a 12-month walkthrough at the end of a project. If a project is complete, we come back and the team comes back 12 months later as a warranty walkthrough, because the elements of the structure in the site are generally guaranteed or warranted by the contractor and the site installer for 12 months. And so we want to come back at about the 11-month mark and say, how's it going? What have things changed? Let's get some things that are under warranty. And then the warranty is, Claire and Karen have said, shifts to the owner to maintain it. And in the contract, it's talked about they assume responsibility at this time to maintain it as it goes along. And like all of you, we keep in touch with our past clients, because there might be a phase 2 or a different project like that, and to just make sure it's good to be ahead of issues that may come up after construction when construction is underway, but also when construction is completed. It's much easier to address a problem before it becomes an issue, a big issue. Let's catch it as it happens, because errors do get made and buildings shift and information doesn't happen all the way along. It's best to be a good team player, and the agreements and the insurance help us with that.
And George, from a liturgical consultant point of view, I would imagine you probably have a lot less risk and liability than the architect does. What type of insurance might you carry, if any? And have you ever run any cases that are unique to your discipline?
Generally speaking, like you said, the liability of a consultant is virtually non-existent compared to, say, the architect or the building contractor and the engineers. And generally speaking, I create a contract that makes it clear that as the consultant, I'm not doing anything that I should be liable for. I'm not responsible for electrical. I'm not responsible for structural issues, etc. All of this winds up being the purview of the architect and the builders, etc. Have I run across any special cases? Not really. I have not had to take out any specialized insurance as a consultant or anything like that. Where it gets tricky is with the artists, and I usually make it clear that the artist is responsible for their own insurance, etc., and things like this. So generally speaking, I don't need insurance because there's very little true liability as far as health and welfare go with the consultant.
And Karen, from the architect or from the artist perspective, you're physically making something that is oftentimes being shipped across the country or to a different location. How do you deal with insurance and liability issues?
It has it has depended at different seasons of my career. When I had was renting light industrial space, I had to have insurance for that, for liability, and I would pay for insurance for shipping because I didn't want a large sculpture lost going across the country. But after I didn't need a large studio, then I eventually stopped carrying insurance just because I couldn't afford it. And prices of bronze were tripling and right and left, and I still needed to keep things within a manageable cost. So insurance was one of the things that, I let go. The church takes responsibility once they receive the sculpture, and I'm really careful in letting them know what the weight is, and so that they can prepare the foundation and or what they need with if they want to do the base from their stone, however we do the installation on pedestals or anything like that, they have to know the details so that then it's their responsibility. I think
Claire, do you
that's
have
it.
anything to add?
No, it's just exactly what Karen said. Same thing.
Great. Well, I think we all wanted to have a time of Q&A right now. So if anybody had any questions or thoughts that came up from the discussion, at this time, we'd like to open the floor. If you want to direct it to one of our roundtable participants here, that would be helpful as well. So just open the floor. If you could just raise your hand or flag it in Zoom, that would be great. Ken?
Yeah, I'll see if I can squeak this out here with my voice. One of the areas, and this will be a question for the consultants here today, one of the areas that I have always been concerned about is in the design of baptismal fonts. And I would limit my work to conceptual design, and I would emphasize safety quite a bit in the design, but also show examples of, guards underneath the water surface and different things, height, talk about all the safety issues. And then I would also make sure that the architect was involved in the construction documents so that the actual design, the details were handled by somebody else. So I'm just wondering if, the other consultants here, George, maybe start with you, but others who have designed fonts, what you found or how you approach it.
Well, sadly, I haven't had the opportunity to design a font that a person would fall in. So that issue hasn't come up for me. But once again, like you were saying, I emphasize that I'm here for the concept, and then you got to bring in the architect or the builders or those who are familiar with local codes, etc., as far as safety goes, and then modify design accordingly so that it meets those requirements. Would be my approach. The closest thing I've come to in that regard was a community that wanted to hang a very large sculpture from one of the walls of their church, and they did not have an architect, they did not have an engineer, and they were inquiring to me, and I said, what's the structure like underneath this wall? And it turned out that it was nowhere near robust enough to handle the weight, and they had to completely change things for that reason. So, but.
Paul, have you ever run across any issues regarding baptismal fonts and code research and designs?
Yeah, we've done immersion fonts all the way up to, just the small pedestal fonts, and boy, the things that we need to look at the slip resistance of the materials that you step in. the safety zones around the font. The height of the handrail or guardrail around the font varies, and it's changed over time. It used to be 28, then to 36 inches, and now it's 42 inches, and how that looks beautiful, yet still meet the code. What's the quality of the water? Will it affect the bronze, or will it affect the marble, or will it affect the copper? And some of those, so do we test that? How do you drain it? How frequently do you clean it? And as we've mentioned a number of times, it's being upfront and explaining these situations with the building committee and with the priest of what you might expect and what's your responsibility as to maintain it as it goes forward. I'm sure everybody on this call has got a call 10 years later and he said, such and such doesn't look the same way it did when you installed it. Well, have you been maintaining it? And then there's that pause, and then we have another discussion.
Marilyn.
I had an experience of an architect who had never done a font, and I spent a lot of, well, first of all, I tell them all that it might leak. So let's work on making sure that it isn't going to leak. And, you know, just a lot of what Paul said, but I got this architect to work with a peer architect to design the font because this man was in over his head. So I just made sure that he worked with somebody who had done a lot of fonts before. He wanted to make a font out of wood, totally. And, you know, that isn't going to work. So I think that it's really important to have the conversation with the people also, besides, you know, the person that's going to build it, because they have a lot of fears over fonts. You know, is it going to leak, or is it unsanitary, or what is the quality of the water? Those are all their fears that you need to address. And how do we set it up so somebody's not going to fall in? You know, and the importance of the shape of it. So even though I'm not designing it, I do have a lot of input as to what is it about, and, you know, and help with the design in the making of it.
I want to add just a little bit in there is oftentimes when with the font and other things, are there liturgical steps we want to take during the course of it as we're starting excavating for the font, or if we're doing this, how do we want to have certain rituals or blessings during the course of it, which is very, very helpful and impactful, because again, it might be the only font they ever work on in their life. And it's an opportunity to really teach and enjoy and be exposed to it.
That's beautiful. Peggy?
Thank you. This is really a great webinar. I've got two questions, and I think probably more for architects and the artists. The first is, what do you charge, or do you charge if you're making a bid? And the second is, do you have a kick-out clause in case they don't like what you've done so far, or you don't want to do what they want you to do? Maybe
we'll start with Paul on that one.
I'll start out. Sometimes we compete and bid. If we ask in the course of the selection process, what are the key criteria for selecting the architects? If their first question or their first statement is depends on the amount of your bid, that influences a little bit how I think working with this committee is gonna be. I tend to like to be selected based on qualifications and have our fees be reasonable and within the realm of you know, the standards of the industry. Typically our agreements that I had mentioned, the 39-page AIA form, has approval processes that goes around that allows opt-out by the client or the architect. it has to be in writing, and sometimes it's based on performance, sometimes it's just based on fit. Or I have projects that started 14 years ago and they're still in schematic design because time just takes a long time to do that, and as it goes. That's sort of my two aspects.
I have
Karen?
an answer also, and it depends on the project, but I do a proposal for the design phase of the commission of whatever. And through the design consultant, they requested I put in a paragraph about right of refusal. So I would charge for the design phase a percentage of the total, and then the right of refusal says, is the intent of this contract that the artist create a maquette for the approval of the design, on and on. Anyway, if the maquette is completed, the client does not wish to commission the life-size work, the client may refuse the created artwork. In that case, the artist will retain the refused artwork and the non-refundable design fee, free of any claims or interest in the client, who will owe the artist no additional fees. So I think having a right of refusal, but usually, right, so we do that. Then I do a just separate contract when they agree we want the life size.
Yeah, I mean, my experience has been that I've never had anyone use the kick out clause, but it just relieves their mind. So they think, okay, if we hate it, we don't have to go all the way to the end and pay for it.
And you get paid for your design.
Right,
You
right.
get paid for the time that you put into it. That's why I don't do the thing where there are some churches that want 3 different artists to present a design for that project and then choose. I hope that's not done anymore, but I won't do that because my time is valuable.
Gilbert.
Actually, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The question actually kind of follows on what Karen just asked, because if a congregation wanted to do a competition between different artists, and they would provide an amount for the artist to produce an initial sketch. I'm just wondering what's your experience with that? And then also, what do you consider to be an appropriate amount? So like if we were to say 10% of what we're estimating the art piece to be, or 5%, and some artists are going to say that they don't want to pay for that, and that impacts it. But I'm just kind of curious what, from the artist's standpoint specifically, how they would approach that.
Well, I've never had someone offer to pay me for
Oh.
for my design. And so I don't have experience in that. I think, and I'm not sure how I would schedule that, because I'm not sure they'd want to pay for what the time is really worth. That's where, and the amount of time that's required in learning about the church. Like when I did a St. Francis and St. Clare, I read about 6 books on Franciscan spirituality and history. And, you put so much into it before you even pick up a pencil. And so I can't do it that way. I mean, I would gain a lot spiritually, but still.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump in on that one because I couldn't agree more with Karen. If it were just a question of producing something, then you can always produce something. But it's more a question, as Karen said so beautifully, of getting into the mind and the heart of that particular community. Because, while sure that the work will be that artist's work, it has to come through your spirit in order to come out on a page. And as high-minded as that might sound, it's really the basis of creating art for anything. unless I would think commercially might be different, but no, I think she said that beautifully, that my only experience of receiving a fee for doing a project was way back. In fact, Ken, you were on that project for St. Rita. Gosh, back in the 80s. When was that? Late 80s. And they found a lot of artists. They said, we'd like you to present a proposal. We'll give you $100, you know, if your design is not selected, you know, you don't get anything, but if no, you get $100. But if it is, then of course you get the project. And that was a good enough way to do it. But later in my career, I realized that just, it's not viable for the way I need to work to come up with a whole. And Karen, I think you'd agree.
Yes, the investment in prayer, and I mean, this is a spiritual project, and I hear that coming through all who have spoken today, and I know that's the way you all approach, and so you're in the investment is costly, and I mean you give a lot.
Yeah, if I can jump in on this from the standpoint of a consultant, I would suggest that one of the roles of the consultant is to nip this concept in the bud, and simply just not let it happen.
Really?
For exactly the reasons that
Bravo.
Karen and Claire are talking about. It's not, you're not going to get liturgical art. You're going to get a prize-winning piece of art, but it's not going to be liturgical. It's just no. Yes. So the consultant needs to nip that in the bud. Yes.
Thank
I
you.
think the consultant's role is always to talk about how much work goes into whatever is happening, because people take it for granted. You know, you're just buying an altar, you're just buying a statue, and they do not realize all the things that you have said that go into it. So that is definitely a role that the consultant can play.
Yeah, cannot agree more. Most people, we're so tuned in toward manufacturing and mass production that we think that we can get liturgical art off the shelf at Walmart just like anything else. And it just is not that way. So,
Page
yeah, well
23, a
said.
catalog.
Yes.
Brian and everyone, I got a quick jump off for a one. Good to see you. You can keep talking, but I'm going to drop off.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, with that note, we are at the end of our time here. I do want to thank everybody for joining the webinar and being a part of the conversation. Thanks again to our panel who gave their time to think through this and guide us through this conversation.